Hi, and welcome to this Introduction to Python course. So first, let's take a look at what we're going to cover in this course. So what is this course about? It's an introduction to Python from first principles. So there is no assumption that you already know Python. We're going to cover Python from the very beginning. By the time we're done with this course, you will have the knowledge and the understanding to learn more on your own. Because there's going to be a lot of things that you're going to need to know and that you're going to need to learn on your own once you start working with your own projects. Things that a course like this can't possibly cover. But you're going to know the fundamentals of programming with Python as well as some advanced techniques that we're going to cover. We're going to look at some third-party Python libraries, at what those are and how we install them. And then we're going to learn the basics of some of the most common third-party libraries in Python. And those libraries that we're going to cover are going to be useful for numerical computations, for manipulating data sets, and for charting data as well. So here's a brief high-level overview of what we're going to do in this course. The first thing, of course, is we're going to look at installing and running Python. Then we're going to look at basic principles in Python, things like variables and simple data types like numerical data types and Boolean data types. We'll look at variables. What are variables and how do we use them? Then we'll look at simple operators, arithmetic operators like plus and minus. We'll look at logical operators, things like less than, greater than. We'll also look at the Boolean operators, the and the or and the not Boolean operators, what those are, and how we use them in conjunction with things like logical operators. Then we'll look at control flow. This is for conditional execution. For example, if some logical expression is true, then do this. Otherwise, do something else. That's called conditional execution. We're also going to look at iteration. And we're going to look in Python at the concepts of iterables and iterators and how that ties in with the different types of loops that are available in Python. We'll also look at exception handling. Exception handling is actually a form of control flow. So we can actually, in our applications, trap an error. When an error occurs, we can actually trap it and decide to do something about it. We'll look then at more advanced data types. So we're going to look at things like sequence types, which are things like lists and tuples and strings. Then we'll look at dictionaries and sets, what those are and how they work. And then we're also going to take time to focus on dates and times. Date and time manipulation is actually quite important, especially if you're dealing with, let's say, time series data. A lot of the data sets that we work with in real life involve dates and times. And so we need to be able to understand how those data types are represented in Python, how we work with them, and how we handle things like time zones and daylight savings. All these are complicated, but there are ways that Python makes it easy, and there are ways that third-party libraries make it even easier. So we'll cover those too. And then we'll look also at another data type called the decimal data type. When we're working with financial data, very often floats isn't good enough because, as we'll see in this course, there is a certain level of imprecision in how real numbers are stored using the standard float data type, which we'll cover. And so we'll take a look at this other data type, which is related to real numbers, but which gives us a much better handle on precision. Then we'll take a look at functional programming. Basically, what are functions? How do we write functions? Why do we write functions? We'll take a look at something called higher order functions, the fact that functions in Python are higher order functions, and we'll take a look at what that means. In context of that, we'll look at things called closures and decorators. So these become more advanced topics in functional programming, which we'll cover in this course. And then finally, we'll get to object-oriented programming, and we'll see what that is, and then how we can create these things that we call custom classes. And we'll look at methods and properties in these custom classes. Then we'll take a look at data acquisition. And by that, I mean, how do we take data from maybe a CSV file? Or how do we retrieve data over the web from some API that is available that we can query? There are lots of APIs that can be queried, and they have to be queried over HTTP. So we'll take a look at all that. We'll take a look at this JSON data format, which is typically how the data is transmitted when we're looking at REST APIs. And we'll take a look at how that works, how REST APIs work, and how we can use them and call them from a Python program. And then finally, we'll take a look at some third-party libraries. Now, there are many third-party libraries available for Python, so we'll cover the basics of a few libraries that you will find very useful. And for some of these libraries, you will then have also enough information to start digging into areas of the library that you may want to invest more time in for your particular application. So we'll look at the PyTZ library, which is really useful for handling time zones and daylight savings issues. We'll look at the dateutil library, which, as we'll see, can be very useful for passing the date that we might find, let's say, in a CSV file, which is really just text, into an actual date object in our Python code. Then we'll look at the requests library, which is what we'll use to actually query APIs. And then we'll look at NumPy, which is useful for numerical analysis and especially dealing with arrays or matrices. We'll look at pandas, which is very useful for dealing with data sets. And then we'll look finally at matplotlib, which is a handy library for charting. Now, there are some prerequisites to this course. First of all, you'll need either a Windows or a Mac machine, because we need to be able to run Python 3.6 and above. As of recording this video, the latest version of Python is at 3.9, and this is the version of Python that I'm going to suggest that you install on your machine. But at the very least, you should be using Python 3.6 and above. Which means that for Windows, you're going to need a Windows 10 machine. And then for the Mac, you need Mac 10.9 or higher. Now for Linux, you can use Linux as well, and it's going to be very similar to the way things work on the Mac. The installation is just a little bit different. You usually have to use the package manager that's associated with your particular Linux distribution. I will cover how to install Python on Windows and on Mac. I will not cover how to install that on a Linux system because there are so many flavors of Linux. And if you're using Linux, you probably already know how to install packages using Linux. You will also need to have some familiarity with the terminal, that's the Mac Linux world, or the command prompt in the Windows world. And that's because it's going to be needed to install and run Python. We're going to do that via the terminal. But you don't need to know advanced terminal or command prompt, just the basics. So you need to know how to open and terminate a shell, right? You need to know how to change to a specific directory using the cd command. You need to know how to list the content of a directory, either using ls on Mac Linux or using dir in Windows. You need to be able to create a directory, although you could actually use the Finder on the Mac, or you could use File Explorer on Windows to do that as well. It's just simpler if we do it from the command prompt, since we'll already be in the command prompt. Now, no prior Python knowledge is needed for this course. I do not assume that you know any prior Python. You also technically do not require any prior programming knowledge in any other particular language. It will be useful because that means that you probably know how to code. In other words, how to use code to solve the particular problem you're trying to solve. In here, I'm going to teach you how to do that using Python, but you're still going to have to be able to formulate your problems and solve them using an algorithmic approach. And so prior programming knowledge would be helpful. Now, in terms of the course structure and the materials, each topic that we're going to cover in this course is actually organized in two parts, except for the first section, which is the installation and running Python. Everything else after that, each topic is organized into two parts. There's a lecture video where I kind of explain the concept, explain maybe some code, explain the topic, and for that you can basically just sit back and watch and take notes, of course, if you like. But then there's a second part to the topic, which is the coding section. So I split those into two videos, the lecture video and the coding video. Now for the coding video, don't sit back. You really should be running Python as well as when you're looking at the coding video and typing along with me, following along with me, and pause the video. Rewind the video if you have to. Type code. But you need to get exercise, right? You need to get practice in coding. So the coding videos are when we go through practical examples together, and so you should be coding these as well at the same time. And then there are exercises. Each section, except the installation section, has a set of exercises. So you really ought to go through those exercises and make sure that you're confident in the topic of that section and in how to solve the problems posed in the exercises before you move on to the next section. Because in this course, we keep building on top of previous sections. So if there's a section that you're not comfortable with yet, it will be more difficult if you keep progressing without mastering that section first. And then we have the downloadable course materials. So all coding videos have an accompanying Jupyter Notebook, this Python code file, and potentially resources as well, like data files, like maybe a CSV file or an Excel file that we're going to use in the Python program. So those Jupyter Notebooks contain all the code that we do in the video. And then the downloads contained any of the required extras, such as the data sets. And then the notebooks are fully annotated. So Jupyter Notebooks allows us to intersperse text and code. So the notebooks that you can download in the course materials contain not just the code that we're actually typing, but explanations about the code as well. So there's a lot of detail in those Jupyter Notebooks. So I strongly encourage that you load them up and take a look at them as well. All right, thank you for watching. And in the next section, we're going to look at how to install and run Python. Thank you for joining me, and let's get started.